Indonesia is one of the world's most resource-rich nations. Its archipelago boasts vast reserves of oil, natural gas, coal, minerals, timber, and a wealth of marine and agricultural resources. But it's kind of hard to actually quantify just how rich Indonesia is in natural resources, right? There's lots of studies out there that says how Indonesia is rich in natural gas, for instance. Here's a graph on Indonesia's oil reserves, data from the Statistical Review of World Energy. Here, you can see that Indonesia's oil reserves have been going down since 1991. But even so, their reserves for 2020, which is over 2.4 billion barrels, is estimated to be worth over $150 billion, based on average global oil prices in 2020. That's a significant amount, but it's not just about oil. Indonesia also has massive reserves of natural gas, nickel, ore, and a long list of other natural resources. To put it in simpler words, Indonesia is one of the world's richest nations in natural resources. Here's a graph on the total natural resource rents as a percentage of GDP of Indonesia. Data from the World Bank. What this data depicts is how much of Indonesia's economy relies on its natural resources. Natural resource rents refer to the revenue generated from the extraction of natural resources like oil, gas, minerals, and forests, minus the costs of extraction. Here you can see that back in the 1980s, Indonesia had relied heavily on natural resources for its economy. In 1979, it rose to a massive 34.9%. Nowadays, it hovers in low, single digits. Nonetheless, it's still impressive if we compare Indonesia to economies that are successful, yet don't rely on natural resources. Let's update this graph and add some successful economies that have limited natural resources. Here in this newly updated graph, you can see that these three economies, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, did not even change. There were small increases, for instance. If we just zoom into these economies, excluding Indonesia, we get to see that South Korea had relied on natural resources in the past, but it was minimal. The same was for Japan. Now, here's where we are getting at. Natural resources are often portrayed as a blessing. Countries like Norway have managed their natural wealth exceptionally well, using their oil revenues to build a sovereign wealth fund that supports the economy even when oil prices fluctuate. There's also the rich Middle Eastern economies, which saw their economy explode in growth in just a couple of decades. As a matter of fact, let's compare Indonesia to these economies in the total natural resource rent. Here you can see that Norway, which has used oil revenues to boost their economy, actually had historically lower natural resource rents than Indonesia. And throughout the coming years, they had the same economic impacts. Middle Eastern economies, on the other hand, are higher than Indonesia. But it's not extraordinarily high. In 1979, for instance, the year where total natural resource rent in Indonesia was over 34.9%. For the United Arab Emirates, it was 56.7%. This is higher than Indonesia, but if you compare Indonesia to South Korea, for instance, the gap is much wider. So, here's where we are getting at. It's the fact that Indonesia has been blessed with so many natural resources, yet for some reason, when we actually compare the economic output of Indonesia to these economies, Indonesia actually lags far, far behind. This does not even require a deep explanation, as many of you may already know that Indonesia is indeed an economy that has lower economic output per capita than Norway, some oil-producing Middle Eastern economies, and the East and Southeast Asian economic tigers. So knowing this, it requires an explanation. A lot of people should question why Indonesia is still lagging behind, despite its abundance in natural resources. Let's first talk about a concept called the resource curse. The resource curse is a well-documented economic paradox, where countries endowed with abundant natural resources tend to experience less economic growth, lower levels of development, and higher levels of poverty than resource-poor nations. Yes, it's not just Indonesia that suffers from this. Let's take the total natural resources rent again and see several African, Asian, and South American economies. Here, you can see that a lot of these economies are heavily dependent on natural resources. These very economies, especially the Democratic Republic of Congo, are well known to be very abundant in natural resources. Yet, these economies are poor, much poorer than Indonesia. So, why does this phenomenon occur? Well, there's a concept called the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease refers to a situation where the discovery or exploitation of natural resources leads to a rise in the country's currency value. This makes other sectors like manufacturing and agriculture less competitive in global markets because exports become more expensive. The term comes from the Netherlands' experience in the 1960s when they discovered natural gas, which led to a decline in their manufacturing sector. To put it into a simpler explanation, when a country makes a lot of money from natural resources, its currency becomes stronger. While that might sound good, it actually makes it harder for other industries, like factories or farming, to sell their products to other countries because their goods become more expensive. This can cause the economy to rely too much on natural resources and ignore other important sectors. In Indonesia's case, this means that while the country earns a lot from oil, gas, and minerals, industries like manufacturing, technology, and agriculture don't grow as fast as they could. This makes Indonesia's economy vulnerable because if the prices of natural resources drop, the economy can suffer badly. Then, there's also the fact that Indonesia's natural resources, which are substantial, have led the government or its private corporations to invest less on important sectors like manufacturing and more into these commodity-based industries. To understand how that works, here's a graph on Indonesia's total non-tax revenue. This data is about the fiscal revenues of Indonesia. It is how the government of Indonesia collects money, whether it be from taxes or, as shown in the graph, from non-tax sources. This non-tax revenue can come from Indonesia's oil and gas sector and other natural resources. And as you can see, this is a very big amount of money. For 2019, it was over 409 trillion rupiah. That's over 29 billion US dollars. When we compare this to the tax revenues of Indonesia, we get to see just how substantial oil and gas contributes to Indonesia's economy. Here in the updated graph, you can see that in 2019, Indonesia's tax revenues was over 1,546 billion rupiah. It's a lot bigger than their non-tax revenues, but you should keep in mind that there's over 270 million people in Indonesia, and all of these people pay taxes directly and indirectly to the government. Therefore, the 409 trillion rupiah of non-tax revenues is still a significant amount, considering it comes from a limited number of sectors, mainly oil, gas, mining, and other natural resources. Now, there's another problem that Indonesia faces, and it's what most of you may already know: corruption and rent-seeking. One of the central explanations for Indonesia's paradox of poverty, despite resource wealth, is corruption. During the New Order era, a significant share of revenues from natural resources was captured by elites through corrupt practices. Large sums were diverted to enrich government officials and politically connected business groups, rather than being invested in public services or infrastructure. This rent-seeking behavior led to inefficiencies and a lack of accountability in how resources were managed. Even in the reform era, corruption has persisted. Government reports and academic studies reveal that corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency continue to hamper the effective use of resource revenues. For example, the mismanagement of revenues from mining projects has often led to environmental degradation and little improvement in local living standards. Instead of creating sustainable development, resource wealth has sometimes resulted in enclave economies, where only a small segment of the population benefits. Just to show you this quantitatively, let's graph out some of the largest corruption cases in Indonesia. Here's a graph for that matter. What you should know about this graph, however, is that in every case, corruption and the amount of money lost differs. For instance, in the case of Jiwasraya, it was reported that Indonesia lost 16.8 trillion rupiah from the Jiwasraya's saving plans investment. Bank Century, on the other hand, was reported to lose 7 trillion rupiah and another 689 billion rupiah from a short-term funding facility of Bank Century. Put simply, each case is different, but as many articles report, these are the amounts lost or corrupted. As you can see, these amounts are massive. In Jiwasraya, 16.8 trillion in US dollars is over 1.2 billion. That's a huge amount of money that could have been used to improve public services like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social programs. In the case of Bank Century, the total loss of over 7 trillion rupiah is around $500 million. Again, this is not just a number. It represents funds that could have helped build schools, hospitals, or roads for millions of Indonesians. And what you should know is that while these are the largest cases out there, there's so much corruption cases even in the smallest levels of government. Sum it all up, it's obviously going to be big. Then, thirdly, there's also inequality. Here's a map of Indonesia, and what we are going to discuss is the gross regional domestic product per capita by province of Indonesia. This is important because inequality in Indonesia actually varies greatly depending on the region. Some provinces, like Jakarta and East Kalimantan, have much higher income levels compared to provinces in eastern Indonesia, such as Papua or East Nusa Tenggara. For instance, in Jakarta, as of 2023, it has a regional per capita of over 322,615,000 rupiah, is approximately $20,324, which is actually very high as compared to the overall per capita of the entire economy of Indonesia, which sits at just $4,876. Here's a graph on the per capita by province of Indonesia. Here you can see that there are indeed provinces that are so much poorer as compared to Jakarta and other richer provinces. The reason why this makes Indonesia poor, despite the abundance in natural resources that has made other provinces rich, is because of poverty. While it is true that Indonesia's overall poverty has gone down, there's actually some provinces that still see high poverty. West Papua, for instance, is reported to have over 25% of its population still living in poverty, which is so much higher than the national average. This poverty rate in some regions then affects Indonesia's economy because it limits the country's overall growth potential. When a portion of the population lives in poverty, it reduces the size of the middle class, which is crucial for driving domestic consumption, the backbone of many thriving economies. People living in poverty have less money to spend on goods and services, which in turn slows down business growth, reduces tax revenues, and limits job creation. Now, while these are amongst the reasons for Indonesia's poor economic performance, there are still, of course, other reasons out there. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.